It's the first week of October, and you know what that means. The Halloween season is officially here. It's the most wonderful time of the year. A time when we walk amongst monsters, ghosts, ghouls, vampires, and creatures of the night. We dress up as them, we laugh at them, and for one night of the year, we get to play pretend. But the man that we're talking about today didn't need to put on a costume to be a monster.
You've said you had a very definite feeling about Rick Chase.
My belief was that Richard Chase now was doing things with small animals and birds, and that he would graduate to larger animals and eventually to people. That he was sick and dangerous.
Is your door locked right now? Are you sure? Could someone slip into your home right now without you knowing? If there's one thing I know for sure, after you listen to this week's episode, you'll never leave your door unlocked again. Yes, it is October. It's my favorite month of the year. It's my birthday month. And to celebrate, I switched up my set a little bit. I'm obsessed. Let me know what you think. Do we love it? Do we hate it? Should I keep it up like this year round? There was big news this week, fellow detectives, and I'm sure a majority of you already know about it because you guys have been DMing me, commenting on every single episode I've ever put out, emailing me, and thank you so much for doing so because this is huge. 2 weeks ago, we investigated the unsolved yogurt shop murders from Austin, Texas in 1991. And in that episode, I said that I have a feeling that this case, even though it's been unsolved for over 30 years, is going to be solved very, very soon. Well, 1 week later, I'm scrolling on Instagram and what do I see? They have linked ballistics and DNA to a serial killer that was active in the South during the 1990s. And that suspect is Robert Eugene Brashers. If you're interested in hearing all the information from this update, I did do an entire TikTok about it. I'll put all my handles on the screen now and I'll put them in the description of this episode. So definitely check that out. And if we do get more information on this update and you want me to do some kind of follow-up episode in the future, just let me know about that in the comments. Unfortunately, the suspect, Robert Eugene Brashers, will never be held responsible because he died in 1999 during a standoff with the police after an unrelated crime. And even though we will never see him be held responsible in a court of law, my only hope is that this brings any amount of closure to the families. But let's get into it. This week's investigation. Warning, this episode will include descriptions of mental illness, SA, extreme acts of violence towards adults, children, and animals, and lots of blood. This is The Disturbed Mind and Crimes of Richard Chase, the Dracula Killer, or the Vampire of Sacramento. And my name is Brianna, and I'm hot on the case. A quick break to talk about today's sponsor, Surfshark. The internet is kind of like the Wild West, except more hackers and less cowboy hats. When you're sending and receiving emails, personal information, or even just using a public Wi-Fi network at a coffee shop or an airport, you open yourself up to so many possible viruses, data breaches, and other headaches that you don't want to deal with. Surfshark makes surfing the internet stress-free by encrypting your data and keeping it hidden from anyone and anything trying to access it. Plus, you can change your virtual location to gain access to things like streaming platforms, sports, or apps that may not be available in your home country. They also have so many products and features that you can explore, like Surfshark Alert, which is my personal favorite. Surfshark Alert immediately alerts you the moment that any of your data, like your credit card or your ID, is leaked online. You can try Surfshark for yourself with no risk with their 30-day money-back back guarantee. Go to surfshark.com/Heim or use code Heim at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. Richard Chase was born on May 23, 1950, and he was raised in Sacramento, California, the same streets that he would later terrorize in his adulthood. Richard was raised in a strict household where physical abuse was used as a form of punishment, but from my research, apparently this abuse wasn't at all untypical for the average family of the time during the 1950s and 1960s. And as early as 10 years old, Richard Chase was showing early signs of becoming a serial killer. Cruelty to animals is the most well-known sign that a child might grow up to become a serial killer. But there is a sort of recipe coined the MacDonald Triad. Now, this is just a theory, but these are 3 indicators that could possibly predict that a child might grow up to become a serial killer. And those are cruelty to animals, bedwetting, and fire starting. Even showing any combination of 2 of these behaviors as a child is a huge red flag. Richard Chase was showing all 3 before he was even 10 years old. By the time he hit high school, Richard Chase was experimenting and then abusing substances and alcohol. Despite this, Richard Chase seemed sort of normal in high school. He had a friendly smile, he had a well-kept appearance, he had lots of friends, and even his fair share of girlfriends. But there was one major problem in all of Richard Chase's relationships, and that was that he was completely impotent. So he couldn't get it up. Richard reportedly even spoke to a psychiatrist to discuss his impotence, and this psychiatrist told Richard that it was likely caused by mental illness or extreme suppressed rage. And instead of seeking treatment, medicine, Richard thought that he could cure his impotence himself. Somehow Richard had come to the conclusion that the reason that he couldn't get it up was because he did not have enough blood in his body to get himself hard. And I think this is what really started his lifelong obsession with blood. Out of high school, Richard became extremely paranoid and delusional. He became convinced that he had all of these really bizarre but very serious health problems. He thought sometimes that his heart would just stop beating, and this was the cause of his lack of blood. He believed that he wasn't getting enough vitamin C, which wasn't the bizarre part. It was how he was trying to treat his vitamin deficiency that was beyond strange. Richard held a fresh orange up to the side of his head because he thought that his brain would absorb the vitamin C. Richard was also convinced that the bones inside of his skull were moving around, and or that he was growing bones out the back of his head. So he shaved his entire head so he could watch the bones move around. Richard was always going to doctors and hospitals trying to seek treatment for all of these problems that he was having. Multiple doctors diagnosed Richard as a hypochondriac, but other than that, nothing was ever really done. Richard, who is already just so paranoid, falls down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, specifically the Nazi UFO conspiracy. He became convinced that Nazis with a UFO abducted him, and then he was used as a test subject. And now Nazis were speaking to him telepathically, threatening to kill him if he did not obey the Nazis. His substance and alcohol abuse was also just getting worse and worse with him living alone, so eventually he moved back in with his parents. Richard's paranoia was not just limited to himself, he was also paranoid about everyone around him. Like, he became convinced that his own mother was poisoning him. Richard's behavior was actually getting so bad for his parents that his dad went and bought him an apartment and then just forced his son to move out, and this is just such bad parenting. Richard is already exhibiting all these really dangerous behaviors. There's already so many red flags, and living on his own, once again, Richard's dangerous behavior, it just all goes from 1 to 100 very quickly. Richard's new apartment was right near a rabbit farm. Richard, who thought that he wasn't getting enough blood, and this was the root of all of his problems that he was having and was looking for a cure, began to capture, kill, and disembowel these little rabbits so he could drink the rabbit's blood and eat them raw. And then with a blender, Richard would make and drink these little bunny rabbit smoothies made out of the rabbit's organs and Coca-Cola. I meant to warn you guys not to eat while watching this episode, that this is not like a lunch break episode. Richard kept doing this for the next handful of years, drinking these little bunny rabbit smoothies, and I wonder if the owner of the rabbit farm realized that all of his little bunny rabbits started disappearing the second that Richard Chase moved in next door. Richard truly did believe that drinking blood was saving his life. Richard's behavior, his violence, it's constantly evolving and escalating. It was getting so worrisome that Richard was actually involuntarily admitted into a psychiatric hospital. Richard had actually gotten really sick, so his dad took him to the hospital, and the doctors determined that Richard had blood poisoning because he was injecting rabbit's blood straight into his veins. And this is what led him to be admitted into the psychiatric hospital in 1975 at 25 years old. And somehow his disturbing behavior and animal cruelty just continued while he was in hospital. On one occasion, staff found Richard in his room with blood smeared all over his face. Turns out he had caught 2 birds from his window, snapped their little necks, and drank their blood. How quick is this guy? First, he's catching dozens of rabbits, and those little guys are really quick, and now he's snatching not 1 but 2 birds out of thin air. Richard even earned himself a little nickname. Aw, how cute. While he's in the hospital, staff thought it was appropriate to start calling him Dracula. And honestly, the next thing that happened, completely on hospital staff. After knowing what got Richard admitted into the hospital, and then the thing with the birds calling him Dracula, I really don't get the mindset on why they chose to do what they did next. The hospital had therapy dogs that they would bring in to visit patients, and in most cases, this is amazing and something I would agree with 100%, but not with Richard Chase, because somehow Richard had smuggled some syringes and needles from somewhere in the hospital, and he was hiding them in his bedroom. And when the therapy dogs came to visit him, he somehow secretly extracted some of the dog's blood so he could drink it. Thankfully, other than that, Richard did not harm these therapy dogs, but I'm just warning you now that other dogs would not be as lucky. But why the hospital would even risk it with Richard Chase, I have no clue. In treatment, Richard Chase was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and after about a year of treatment, the hospital deemed Richard Chase no longer a danger to society, and he was released, and he went straight back to living all by himself. Something that we see so often is that someone who's in a psychiatric hospital will do really well. They will do really well with a strict routine, being monitored 24/7, and after being properly medicated. But once these individuals are back in their everyday routine, that's when problems can arise, especially when that person stops taking their medicine. And that's not me saying that I think every single person with a mental illness should be in a hospital for the rest of their lives. All I'm saying is I've seen this exact circumstance happen in my own life, where someone is properly medicated and then they feel so good, so they stop taking their medicine because they feel better, not realizing that it was the medicine they were taking that was making them feel better, but now they've stopped taking it. And this is what happened with Richard Chase, but allegedly it was actually Richard's mother that made her son stop taking his medicine without talking to his doctor about it. And I don't know if it was because it was the 1970s and his mother was worried about maybe the stigma, but honestly, it doesn't really matter at all, because afterwards, Richard just goes down this downward spiral, and it happens very quickly. Richard stopped performing everyday hygiene. He wasn't grooming himself, he wasn't showering, he wasn't brushing his teeth, he just wasn't taking care of himself at all. At this point, he wasn't even eating real food. Photos of him around this point, next to photos of him in high school, there's such a stark difference. You can literally see the mental decline in a person and what it can do to a person. And his cruelty to animals also unfortunately continued to escalate. He actually began hunting down stray animals like stray cats and stray dogs, and he even went as far to steal his neighbors' pets so he could kill them, drink their blood, and eat them raw, and also turn his neighbors' pets into his foul, bloody smoothies. And because Richard is like a textbook sadist and he like gets off on other people being in pain, on at least one occasion, Richard actually called up his neighbor after killing and drinking and eating this neighbor's dog to tell his neighbor what he just did in explicit detail to this neighbor's dog. And if he couldn't catch and kill his neighbor's pets, Richard would even go to the pet store to buy animals. Richard's mother actually had a pet cat that she loved so much, and one day Richard showed up to his mother's home holding a dead cat. It wasn't her cat, but it was a dead cat. And when his mother opened the door, Richard threw this dead cat at her feet, and then he bent down and with his own hands ripped open its stomach, and then put his hands inside the stomach and then smeared the blood all over his face while he screamed at the top of his lungs. I would have been calling an exorcism right then and there. And I don't know if maybe his mother was just in shock. I mean, I hope she was. That sounds bad. I don't want her to be in shock, but it would at least explain what she did next, because Richard's mother just stood there and watched her son do this to this cat. And then she just closed the door on him. She didn't call for help. She never reported it to the police or her son's doctors or anything. She kind of just washed her hands of the situation and just said that Richard couldn't come over anymore. Richard was also developing a very disturbing and dangerous obsession with firearms, and he began purchasing a lot of them. And when I say that Richard's violence is constantly evolving and escalating, I really mean it. Because from this point on, everything is going to happen in very quick succession with a rapid rise in brutality. In August 1977, while out on patrol near Pyramid Lake in the Nevada desert, some police officers discovered an abandoned car stuck in the sand. When the police officers approach this car, they have their flashlights out. It's late at night. They're in the desert. It's possible that there's no one around them for miles and miles. They peer into this car with their flashlights and imagine the shock and horror when they discover that the entire inside of this car is covered in blood. There were 2 rifles sitting upright in this vehicle, and amongst the blood was a bucket in the back seat that was also covered in blood, and there was what looked like to be organs floating around in the blood bucket. I don't know how old these officers were, but I'm sure they were shaking in their boots, that they were terrified, because who wouldn't be? You find a car dripping floor to ceiling in blood in the middle of the desert. So they start looking around to try and see if the possible owner of this car is anywhere near them, and they see in the distance, kind of near the lake, there's a man standing by the lake. And when they begin to approach this man, they see Richard Chase running around completely naked and covered in blood. And they try to catch him, but remember, this guy is really fast, and I'm sure it would also be really weird to try and grab a grown man that's completely naked and covered in blood, but the police officers they do finally get a hold of him, and they arrest him. They obviously ask him whose blood him and his car are both covered in, and at first he said that it's just his blood. But there's so much blood, like he would be dead if this is his blood. And eventually he admits that he killed a cow and drained the cow of its blood. And it was eventually confirmed that the blood and the liver that was in the bucket in his car was not human blood, it was animal blood. So they just released Richard without any consequences. And after this, Richard Chase stopped targeting animals and he began targeting humans. His first attempted murder was just a handful of months later on December 27th, 1977. Please keep in mind all of the dates I'm going to say from here on out because, like I said, it's all going to happen really fast. In technical terms, Richard Chase is not a serial killer, he's a spree killer because there's no cool down period for Richard Chase. When he started killing, he killed in rapid succession until he was caught, and he was never going to stop unless he was caught. 2 days after Christmas, on December 27th, 1977, while driving around his hometown of Sacramento, California, Richard Chase was peering into every house and every window as he drove by. And while cruising down the street, Richard spotted a woman standing in her kitchen. Dorothy Polinsky was just washing dishes in the comfort of her own home, but there was a madman, unknowingly, watching her. Richard Chase pulled out his firearm and he fired it at Dorothy from his car window, and then he just drove off. The shot fired through Dorothy's kitchen window and barreled at her head and only missed her head by an inch. Dorothy could feel and hear the bullet whisk past her head before getting lodged in the kitchen cabinet behind her. So thankfully, Dorothy did survive. Richard failed his first murder. But only 2 days later, on December 29th, Richard would attempt the same kind of murder again, but this time, he was successful. 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, husband and father of 2, was helping his wife unload shopping bags from her car when Richard drove past him. Ambrose's wife was already taking a load of shopping bags from her car into the home, so her back was to her husband when she heard 2 loud bangs ring out through her neighborhood. She turned around and she saw her husband, the father of her 2 children, laying on the ground with blood pooling from his chest. Richard had shot Ambrose in the chest and then just drove off, and this was tragically fatal. And since Richard is just killing completely at random, there's no leads, no clues, or no suspects for investigators to follow. It's extremely hard to solve a murder when there's no motive other than just murdering someone. For Richard, this was just a test run to see if he could actually do it, if he could actually kill. There was no motive for Richard to kill Ambrose Griffin. It's not even like he was trying to drink his blood, which he would do with his future victims. He truly just killed this man just to see if he could actually kill a person. And when you're killing strangers, it's really hard for investigators to catch you. But luckily, they actually were able to determine really fast that the same gun that was used to fire at Dorothy just 2 days earlier was the same gun used to kill Ambrose. And throughout all of this, you can imagine that Richard's mental health is in a very serious decline. And after killing Ambrose, he actually did have a small stay in a mental hospital to treat his schizophrenia. He was only there for a few days and then he was released. His first stage of test runs and trials were those drive-by shootings to see if he could actually kill someone. Now Richard was in his second stage of test runs, and he went on a spree of breaking into people's homes. Not to rob them, again, just to see if he could do it, if he could get away with it. And he had this weird little quirk, I don't know if you want to call it that, I don't think that's the right word, but Richard Chase infamously would only break into people's homes if their doors were unlocked. If someone left their doors unlocked, Richard Chase saw it as an invitation to just walk into their home. If their doors were unlocked, he thought that he was welcome to just let himself inside. You start to see why he's called the Dracula Killer, the Vampire Killer, the Vampire of Sacramento. Not only is he a blood-drinking killer, but he doesn't enter any homes that he's not invited into. And if you're at all familiar with vampire lore or have seen the Vampire Diaries, you would know that vampires cannot come into your home unless you invite them in. It was a lot more common in the 1970s to just leave your doors unlocked, so sadly, it was really easy for Richard to find victims. And there was actually quite a few amount of times that Richard was actually caught breaking into people's homes. There was one instance where a young couple returned home to find their place completely trashed, and Richard Chase standing in their home. When he was caught, he ran out, and this young couple starts searching their home because there was a weirdo guy standing in there. They want to see if he maybe stole anything. Richard Chase did not take anything, but I guess he did leave some things behind. This young couple actually had an infant, and in their infant's nursery, they discovered that Richard actually urinated on their baby's clothing and also used their baby's crib as a bathroom. There were also a good handful of people that witnessed Richard Chase walk up to their front door, try to open the door, see that it was locked, and then just watched him walk away and go try the next house. And then only about 1 month after murdering Ambrose Griffin, Richard Chase was ready to kill again. January 23rd, 1978, Teresa Wallen left her front door unlocked for just a moment so she could run outside to take out her garbage. But this was just enough time for Richard Chase to slip inside. When Teresa re-entered her house, Richard Chase shot her 3 times. And just a warning, this is definitely Richard Chase's most brutal and sadistic act of violence so far by a landslide. He began by cutting her open and disemboweling her. He was also experimenting, and he cut off one of her nipples. Richard then found an empty yogurt container in the kitchen. He filled it up with Teresa's blood so he could drink it. He then filled the bathtub with Teresa's blood and took a literal blood bath. Richard also SA'd Teresa's body, so now he's also a necrophiliac. And if you're at all confused because earlier in this episode I said that Richard Chase was completely impotent, well, it turns out he finally found a cure for his impotence. It was never an issue that he wasn't getting enough blood. Richard Chase is a sexual sadist, and he can only get off and get turned on by extreme acts of violence. Richard Chase then went outside, found some dog feces, and then shoved it down Teresa's throat and in her mouth. He fled the home, and it was tragically her husband that came home and found her body in this state. I don't even want to begin to imagine what that scene would look like. I don't even know how you go on after finding the love of your life like that. And if you think that it couldn't get any worse, it always does with Richard Chase, because Teresa was 3 months pregnant. And only 4 days later, he would kill again. On January 27th, 1978, Richard let himself in through the unlocked front door of 38-year-old mother, Evelyn Morath. Evelyn was home with her neighbor and friend, Dan Meredith, her 6-year-old son, Jason, and her 22-month-old nephew, David. At the time Richard walked into her home, Evelyn was upstairs in the bath, and Dan was watching over the 2 boys. Immediately, Richard shot and killed Dan at point-blank range. Evelyn's 6-year-old son, Jason, terrified, began running as fast as he could so he could try and get to his mommy, but before he could, Richard shot and killed 6-year-old Jason as well. And then he just walked into the bathroom that Evelyn was taking a bath in, and he shot her in the head, killing her. He dragged her body to her bedroom where he sodomized her and then also SA'd her in other ways. This was the first and only time that Richard Chase ever finished with a woman. Guys, I'm so grossed out. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to say this in a way that I can actually make it through my sentences without throwing up a little bit in my mouth, but it's really, really hard. Richard then drank Evelyn's blood directly from an incision he made in her neck. Does he actually think he's a vampire? At first I thought like the door thing, like he would only go inside a home if he felt he was invited in, that was just a coincidence because he's like the vampire killer and he also drinks blood. From my research, there was nothing that suggested that Richard Chase actually thought that he was a vampire or that he was like trying to seem like a vampire. But now he's drinking blood. He'll only go inside a home if he's invited, and now he's drinking blood directly from someone's neck. Richard stabbed Evelyn all over her body. He cut open her stomach, drained her of all of her blood. He alleges that he drained all of her blood into a bucket and then he drank all of it before pleasuring himself onto her body and leaving the scene. And when police were called to this terrible, terrible scene, they found 3 dead bodies: Evelyn, Dan, and 6-year-old Jason. This was only 4 days after a pregnant woman, Teresa, was found in a very similar way. So they knew that they had a very, very deeply disturbed killer on the loose. But what was really terrifying everyone, even one step more, because with Richard Chase, there's always another step more, Evelyn's nephew, 22-month-old little baby David, was missing. If any of you have ever seen Criminal Minds, it's a very good show if you haven't seen it, but in that show, they are FBI profilers, so they do like criminal profiling. And after Teresa was murdered, they actually did bring in FBI profilers to make a criminal profile of their killer. And alongside with a witness sketch, they released that profile to the public. They said that the killer they were looking for was a tall male that was familiar with the Sacramento area, that he was malnourished, that he was not taking care of himself, that he was a loner that lacked proper hygiene, and he would kill and kill until he was caught. And it actually did not take long at all for a former classmate of Richard Chase's to see this description and see the sketch and immediately recognize it as Richard Chase, and she brought that information to authorities. So the day after Evelyn, Dan, and Jason were killed, authorities tracked down the apartment that Richard Chase was staying in, and they waited outside until he left the apartment so they could make an arrest or at the very least question him. And when Richard Chase exited his apartment, would you be at all surprised to know that he was covered in blood? He was taken into custody and authorities went into his apartment. From floor to ceiling, all over the walls, over every surface in the home, there was blood. Blood covered every inch of this man's apartment. And the kitchen, as you can imagine, was the worst. Every utensil, every cup, every plate, every bowl was covered in blood. The blender that he used to make his smoothies was likely never washed, and there was rotting organs in the bottom of the blender. Several animal parts were found scattered throughout the kitchen. There was a newspaper that was sitting out, and Richard had circled ads in the paper about dogs that were for sale in his area. And on top of Richard Chase's fridge, he had a bunch of pet collars. On Richard Chase's calendar, he had the word today written on the dates that he killed Teresa and then the date that he killed Evelyn, Dan, and Jason. He wrote today on 44 more dates throughout the rest of 1978. So, doesn't take a genius to come up with that. He was probably planning on killing on all 44 of those days as well. And when they opened his fridge, the horrific discoveries continued. Richard had kept several of Evelyn and Teresa's organs, but that's not all. Tragically, there were parts of little baby 22-month-old David in the fridge as well, like the boy's brain was kept in a little container. Reportedly, while Richard was mutilating Evelyn's body, Richard got startled when a 6-year-old girl knocked on the front door because she had plans with Evelyn's 6-year-old son, Jason, that day. So Richard said that he got startled and he just grabbed the baby and ran off. Back at his apartment, he decapitated little baby David and then ate parts of his brain. The rest of baby David was discovered 2 months later, partially mummified in a cardboard box that Richard had dumped his body in behind a church near his apartment. Richard Chase's trial began in 1979, and the prosecution did not need to prove that Richard Chase was the one who killed these 6 people. He even admitted to it, but he said that he was insane while he committed these murders. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty, but Richard's defense team wanted to, at the very most, get second-degree murder so he could spare the death penalty and get life in prison, and their defense was that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. It was even said by multiple people that spoke with Richard Chase that he was the most deranged individual that most of these people had ever seen or spoken to. There were a lot of arguments back and forth if Richard Chase knew what he was doing was wrong, if he was legally sane. On one hand, he would wear gloves when he'd break into these people's homes so he wouldn't leave fingerprints. Seems like a sane thing to do. But at the same time, he would also leave the scenes just completely covered in blood. Doesn't seem like a sane thing to do. It makes it seem like he doesn't know exactly what he's doing. I 100% believe that Richard Chase is severely mentally ill, but I really question that he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. I believe that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Richard Chase knew what he was doing, and he knew what he was doing was wrong, but he did it anyways. Richard Chase was found guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death by gas chamber. In prison, a lot of inmates were terrified of Richard Chase, and I gotta say, I'm not surprised by that at all. Reportedly, a lot of inmates actually hated him so much and were so scared of him that they bullied him and would actually try to convince him to bring an end to his own life because they hated him so much. And on December 28th, 1980, not long after Richard Chase's trial ended, he was found dead in his cell. Reportedly, he had actually secretly stopped taking the medicine the prison was giving him so he could store it, and then later overdosed. And that is the case of Richard Chase, the Dracula Killer, or the Vampire of Sacramento. Have you ever heard of this case before? Let me know all your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Make sure you check back every single Friday. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this week's episode, and I will see all you ghosts and ghouls next week when we are hot on the case once again.